So, we are now in the final week, beginning the final week of lectures. And I've got to cram massive amounts of material into a very short period of time. So, what I'm going to try to do is hit the high points of the post-World World War II world. We covered the Cold War last week. That deserved its own week. Now we're going to go through a few other themes. We're going to start with the dissolution of European empires, which happened basically from the end of World War II through the 1997 handover of Hong Kong from the British to China. But the intense phase is the late 1950s through the late 1960s. That is when most of the Third World was created. Third World being the former colonial empires of Britain and France and other countries that are now newly independent. We talked last week as part of the Cold War about the banner year of 1947, when the British leave Greece to invite Truman to promulgate the Truman Doctrine, but when the British also leave India and Palestine. When they leave India, it is divided into Hindustan, which we call India, and Pakistan, which we call Pakistan, a Hindu and a Muslim state. And Pakistan has two sections, one of which is now called Bangladesh, the other of which is called Pakistan. When Britain left Palestine, it left the UN this hot potato of how to deal with the irreconcilable claims, the apparently irreconcilable claims of Jews and Arabs to the Holy Land. And the United Nations proposed a two-state solution which has a fairly small, very gerrymandered Israel with indefensible borders, and an Arab state centered on the west bank of the Jordan River around Jericho, and with Jerusalem deep within a neck surrounded by Arab territory. But I told you about how 5 Arab armies immediately invade Israel and begin a series of Arab-Israeli wars. That was a foretaste of some of the things that were to come as Europe, which had been organizing the world as the origin point of the imperial powers, becomes unable to continue that and unwilling to continue that in the face of increasing nationalism in the Third World, often stoked by Soviet communism and later Chinese communism. Something happens in 1948 that goes almost unnoticed and uncommented upon. It is not something that the British people debate. It is not something whose implications they discuss. It's not something which even particularly makes much news at the time. It sort of blends in to the background noise of late 1940s Attlee Britain social policy. It's called the British Nationality Act of 1948. And what the British Nationality Act of 1948 does, it changes Britain in every possible way. Now you might ask, how could a law with such far-reaching effects be passed without comment, debate, or public scrutiny? The answer? I don't know. But it was tradition. The answer is debatable. There are people who would argue that this was sneaking something in that would fundamentally change Britain. The Act, the British Nationality Act of 1948, allows anyone in Britain's imperial territories who wants to come home to the British Isles upon the independence of these colonies to come to Britain, that British nationality is extended to the members of the colonial populations. However, even though most people at the time assumes this is for the white settlers who left Britain to settle in the colonies as sort of an administrative class and a military class, that they, being from the British Isles in the first place, would be the ones who would want to return. After all, why would somebody from Central Africa want to return to a place they've never been? Why would somebody from the West Indies? Why would somebody from somewhere in South Asia? Well, Because there is no origin stipulation in this law, because there is certainly no racial stipulation in this law, that would seem racist. Everyone, pretty much, in these colonies is granted British nationality and the right to return to the British Isles. So all of a sudden, starting in the 1950s, a trickle, which then becomes a rush, which then becomes a waterfall of immigration of non-Anglo-Saxon peoples begins to swamp Britain. Dravidians from India and Aryans from North India, Bantu from Central Africa, West Indian Jamaicans from the West Indies, some Maori from New Zealand, not many, but some. All of a sudden, Britain, which had been fairly homogeneous in terms of its ethnic and cultural composition, now becomes as multiracial as the United States of America or any other American territory from Alaska down to Tierra del Fuego, which has a mixture of indigenous peoples, Europeans, and Africans. Except in the case of Britain, it's from all over the world. These groups are going to settle, like all ethnic immigrants, if allowed to, in enclaves, in ethnic neighborhoods, arguably in ghettos. And these ghettos are going to end up resembling their home point of origin more than they resemble what the neighborhoods used to look like before the arrival of the immigrants, which is going to provoke problems. Because certainly for the Ise, the first generation of immigrants, the cultural assimilation into British norms and society is extremely limited. Britain, unlike the United States, does not have an immigrant tradition, a tradition of a cultural melting pot, a tradition of using public education and free market enterprise to mix people. So this is going to change things at home. Big time. At the same time, after 47-48, Britain stabilizes. But by the middle 1950s, there is going to be a definitive moment in terms of the end of empire. And that definitive moment is at Suez, the Suez Canal particularly. Egypt, which is adjacent to the Suez Canal, which has territory both in Sinai to the east and in Egypt proper to the west of the Suez Canal, is given its independence under King Farouk, I think in 1953 or 54. Very quickly, Farouk is overthrown by a group of young officers led by the Ba'athist nationalist Gamal Abdel Nasser. Baathism is Arab socialism. It's a mixture of Arab culture and some Islamic teachings with socialist and Marxist tendencies. And most Arab national movements in the 1950s and 60s and 70s is Ba'athist. It isn't until the 80s that this begins to change. Saddam Hussein was a Ba'athist. The Assads in Syria, Baathists. And what this Arab nationalist, this Arab socialist, Nasser, does is he starts letting the East and West compete for things like building the Aswan High Dam, which is going to dam up and control the Nile River, which is a big deal, because without the Nile River, Egypt doesn't exist. Originally, there was going to be an American contractor building it. But Egypt began closing the straits that headed towards the Israeli port of Eilat in southern Israel on one of the horns of the Red Sea, the eastern horn, the Gulf of Aqaba. So since since Egypt closes off one of Israel's necessary shipping bases, to punish them, we say, the United States, we're not going to build the canal. So Nasser invites the Soviets, who are happy to build the Aswan High Dam, which which gives Egypt problems now because they did a mediocre job. But the Soviets built it. And Nasser becomes more and more a client state of the Soviet Union. It's never as bad as Eastern Europe, but for a while the Soviets would call the tune and Nasser would dance to it, to an extent. Of course, he'd never admit to this. So, after the Soviets agree in the I think in early 56, maybe in late 55, Nasser nationalizes the Suez Canal, which is a violation of treaty. When the British gave Egypt its independence, the agreement was that a multinational corporation, basically run by Britain and France, was going to manage the canal for the international community. When Nasser nationalizes the canal, he violates that agreement. After Winston Churchill retires, his replacement, in 1952-53, Attlee is overthrown by an election, and Churchill comes back, but he's largely senile. By 1955, Churchill leaves, 56. The new Prime Minister, Anthony Eden, is in charge. And Eden sees Nasser's grab of the Suez Canal like Hitler marching into the Rhineland. He's not wrong, by the way. As a sign of early aggression. And unlike Chamberlain, he's not going to appease it. So a secret agreement is going to be made to deal with the Egyptian nationalization of the canal, which we will get to next lecture.